Hello all. We are picking up lesson 33, lecture 3, where we are concluding our discussion of Nero's reign. So I want to start this discussion with a section of Tacitus's book 15 that I think is a good measure of how much ancient thinkers, including Tacitus, connected Nero's vices with the whole degeneration of Roman values and what it meant to be Roman. And so the way this gets described is in one of my favorite sections of all Tacitian narrative, which we are going to read, that begins with a description of a really unusual party that Nero gives at this time. So again, we are sort of in the post 62 phase of Nero's rule. No more Seneca, no more Burrus, no more Mother. In fact, even he at this point has divorced his wife, who was, you recall, Claudius's daughter, and married a former lover called Poppaea Sabina. What exactly that means is even unclear, as it will become obvious from these next few passages. So this is Tacitus book 15, gives us a description of, I think this is section 36 of book 15, or 37, describing Nero in Rome at this time, giving a party. So he himself, that would be Nero, to create the impression that no place gave him equal pleasure with Rome, began to serve banquets in the public places and to treat the entire city as his palace. In point of extravagance and notoriety, the most celebrated of the feast was that arranged by Tigellinus, and this is one of the new heads of the Praetorian Guard, which I shall describe as a type, instead of narrating time and again the monotonous tale of prodigality. He constructed then a raft on the pool of Agrippa and superimposed the banquet to be set in motion by other craft acting as tugs. The vessels were gay with gold and ivory, and the oarsmen were catamites, marshaled according to their ages and their libidinous attainments. So let's just stop there for a second. Catamites in this context would mean men who were willing to be bottoms in a sexual encounter with another man, who were thought of as sort of very much emasculated in Roman imagination. He had collected birds and wild beasts from the ends of the earth and marine animals from the ocean itself. This would be giving us a sense of the good food served. On the quays of the lake stood brothels filled with women of high rank, and opposite, naked harlots met the view. First came obscene gestures and dances. Then, as darkness advanced, the whole of the neighboring grove, together with the dwelling houses around, began to echo with song and to glitter with lights, right? So it seems this is one big crazy party. It's, you don't know anymore what's land, what is the sea. You don't know anymore who is a woman of high rank versus a prostitute. The men are not considered very masculine, and the food is good. So let's see how it continues. Nero himself, defiled by every natural and unnatural lust, had left no abomination in reserve with which to crown his vicious existence. It's a fun translation there, to crown his existence. Except that a few days later, he became, with the full rights of legitimate marriage, the wife of one of that herd of degenerates who bore the name Pythagoras. Let's stop there. Pythagoras is, of course, a name that you might know as one of a Greek mathematician. The Pythagorean theorem, hopefully, is still somewhere in your mind. This is not him, okay? Pythagoras, in this context, is just a Greek name. It is very clear for two things. One, that this is a man. And second, that this is someone who is probably of slave or slave background, or definitely no higher ranking than a freedman, right? So Nero became the wife of a Greek slave. Okay. The veil was drawn over the imperial head. Witnesses were dispatched to the scene. The dowry, the couch of wedded love, the nuptial torches, they were there. Everything in fine, which night enshrouds, even if a woman is the bride, was left open to the view. So the idea here is that Nero undergoes a marriage ceremony. And I think the point here is not so much about his sexual desires. The Romans would not necessarily judge Nero wanting to have sex with another man as long as he is the top. He's clearly the bottom here, right? Is that he is the one who is wearing the veil, right? He is performing as the woman in this marriage ceremony. But this whole event mocks everything, what's sacred about sort of Roman values, in terms of what a man is a man, what a marriage ceremony means in terms of, creating legitimate children. All that is just all upside down. So this is giving us a sense of how far things go south. And then in my favorite moves, Tacitus continues. So this is 37 to 38, a direct transition. There followed a disaster, whether due to chance or to the malice of the sovereign is uncertain, for each version has its sponsors, but graver and more terrible than any other which has befallen this city by the ravages of fire. The reason I love this transition so much is that sometimes modern writers compare this to almost like being cinematic, right? So the thing we see sort of in the first part of this section in 37, we see this totally unnatural marriage ceremony, a mocking of a marriage ceremony and a mocking of traditional gender roles in ancient Rome. And then without much interruption and without any explanation whether there is a connection, Tacitus says, there followed a disaster. It's a quick cut, but what we do inevitably as readers is we take it as a consequence, okay? Everything was out of order, and there came the fire. And so this is the famous fire, and you can find this, it starts in the summer of 64 in Rome, and this is the depiction that we get about the fire in Tacitus. This is a major, devastating fire. Nero, who at the time was staying in Antium, did not return to the capital until the fire was nearing the house by which he had connected the Palatine with the gardens of Maecenas. That was his own house. It proved impossible, however, to stop it from engulfing both the Palatine and the house and all their surroundings. Still, as a relief to the homeless and fugitive populace, he opened the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, the buildings of Agrippa, even his own gardens, and threw up a number of extemporized shelters to accommodate the helpless multitude. The necessities of life were brought up from Ostia and the neighboring municipalities, and the price of grain was lowered to 3 sesterces. Yet his measures, popular as their character might be, failed of their effect, for the report had spread that at the very moment when Rome was aflame, he had mounted his private stage, and typifying the ills of the present by the calamities of the past, had sung of the destruction of Troy. So this is again a rather famous scene. Let me give you a modern drawing of it. So the fire breaks out, and it's a really devastating fire. More than half of Rome is almost burned to the ground, including Nero's own palace, where he lived up to that point. Nevertheless, what may also stand out is that Nero is doing quite a few good things, right? Clearly, he is creating places for people to stay and food, providing food to eat, and making sure that people are not selling things too expensively because of the catastrophe that just happened. But nevertheless, this rumor still stands that he is supposedly singing about the destruction of Troy. And given that now you are such educated consumers of Virgil and all of that Troy represents, of course, Troy also ended up being burned by a fire. But I think what's important is that the Romans were the ones fleeing the fire. And here, and Tacitus implied this very, very clearly, there is even maybe the possibility, and we have to kind of go back to this section, that it could be that it was either chance or the malice of the sovereign. So some people actually thought that maybe Nero wanted this fire started. And I think the explanation to why that is, that people thought that maybe he was the reason that Nero wanted this fire to take place, has to do with something that if you take a look on your handout is on the very bottom, and it is Nero's golden house. And so after the fire sort of cleared out so much pretty high-end real estate in the city of Rome, Nero created a beautiful new palace. It took about 4 years to build. And it is a ginormous villa on 3 hills in the city of Rome. And the kind of descriptions we get, essentially it has gems in the ceilings, everything. It's called the Golden House for a reason. Everything is very expensive. And the people even quoted, Suetonius did, that Nero said, finally I can live like a human about this house. So supposedly nothing ever before was sufficient for him. So it leaves us with this idea that Nero, in fact, wants this fire so he can create a new Rome. But this new Rome is sort of almost like the opposite of what Rome, the traditional Rome, the Rome of Augustus, stand for. So there is one more bit that's super interesting in this description of Tacitus that I want to turn to now. And that is that how Nero responds after he finds out about the fact that people are saying that, maybe he was responsible for the fire. So this is against Book 15. But neither human help nor imperial munificence nor all the modes of placating heaven could stifle scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. Therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men hated for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not only in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital, that is Rome itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. First then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Hence, in spite of a guilt which has earned the most exemplary punishment, there arose a sentiment of pity due to the impression that the Christians were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. So a number of things stand out here. Obviously, Nero, the first factual statement is that Nero blamed the Christians. I think Tacitus is also very clear that people did not necessarily believe that the Christians started this fire, but that this was sort of an excuse. And then also we get this description that the punishments were very cruel. They are burned on crosses. They are, torn apart, which is considered rather cruel punishment even by Roman standards. What really is interesting for us when we put back our historian hats, that Tacitus knows this stuff about Christianity. And so if for a moment we are thinking about sort of what we know about early Christianity, I think that it's super interesting for us to think about sort of how much there might have been in Rome at this time. So, wherever exactly we are in the chronology, sometime around the year 30 CE is when Jesus dies. And we have some documentary, let's rephrase that. We have some items that people claim survive from that period, including the Shroud of Turin is just one example. I think we would consider it from a historical perspective doubtful. And in fact, the first sort of visual evidence we have for a depiction of Jesus will not be until the year 235, when on the wall of a building in Dura Europus in Syria, we see that there is somebody lying on a bed. And then we see a figure here who has his hand stretched forward, maybe pointing or holding an object. And then we see that person walking away who was lying on the bed before. And this is a healing of the paralytic, and this would be Jesus. This is considered the first reliable depiction of Jesus. So what exactly would Tacitus know? And I think the story would have to be told via one of the students of Jesus, the Apostle Paul, who traveled actually from the Jerusalem area, all the way around the Eastern Mediterranean, including to Rome. And so we are pretty certain that, in fact, it was the case that in the year 64, when the fire burned, there would have been Christians in the city of Rome. So far, that is correct. But we also get in Tacitus already is that clearly Tacitus thinks very negatively of the Christians. He thinks of it almost like a disease, and that these are people who are hated. But I think one thing that's also clear from this, that it is not considered that the Christians were in fact convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for the hatred of the human race. The point being is that people dislike them because they think they don't try to be very good Romans or very good parts of the traditional Roman community, but nobody thinks they are guilty of the arson. So these are now the final bits of the of Nero's rule here, and where I want to go to is I'm not going to talk in so much detail about the conspiracy that takes place in the year 65, the conspiracy of Piso, which will lead essentially to the death of Seneca himself, who is actually not very much involved and who will commit a suicide that you can read about on your own, which is almost like a Socratic suicide, and is really trying to create an impression of what is a good way to go. The following year, 66, even more figures die, and it will all sort of come to an end in the year 68, which is where we're going to end our discussion. And so let's find out what's happening. And so for historical context, we find out that there is a revolt taking place at this point out there, in fact, in the Judea area around Jerusalem. And quite a few of the individuals who are involved in that war are showing some very important leadership skills. But it's also the case that everywhere around the empire, there is sort of a sense of change being necessary. And in particular, among the military, we find some desire to put in essentially a new emperor. Here is the problem. There is nobody left of the Julio-Claudian family to find, to put into an emperor. And so that will create its own problem. But for today, I want to focus on less on that sort of search for the next emperor, and instead want to focus on sort of how Nero goes out, just so that we get a sense of what that was like. So at this point, Nero knows that there is a revolt against him that has a new commander posing as an emperor, and the Senate finds him an enemy of the state, and essentially it's over for Nero. And everybody's urging him, his companions, one and all, urge him to save himself as soon as possible from the indignities that threaten him. He bade them to dig a grave for him in his presence, and at the same time to bring water and food for disposing of his body. He was very concerned about what would happen to his body. As each of these things was done, he wept and said again and again, "What an artist the world is losing." And then he actually gets the letter by one of his couriers, and he read that he had been pronounced a public enemy by the Senate, and that they were seeking him to punish him in the ancient fashion. And he asked about it, sort of what that was like. When he learned that the criminal was stripped, fastened by the neck in a fork, and then beaten to death with rods, in mortal terror he seized 2 daggers and drove a dagger in his throat. First and beyond all else, he had forced from his companions a promise to let no one have his head, but to contrive in some way that he be buried unmutilated. And this was granted. He was buried at a cost of 200,000 sesterces and laid out in white robes embroidered with gold. I think one thing may be worth remembering of Nero's death is that in terms of his last words, which you recall were often collected for emperors, you recall Augustus saying something also about theatricality and clap if you like the way I perform my role. What Nero does at the end, he says, "What an artist the world is losing." So clearly his self-identification is not that of an emperor. And he ended up going down, definitely not playing the part very well, and became a sort of typical bad emperor, if you have to name one, he is usually the first one people think of, how much it was his fault and how much it was a fault of a wider context and was prepared in on under those earlier Julio-Claudian emperors is a matter of historical debate. But what we can sort of have in the stories left behind about him, we can find a sort of deep confusion about what Rome is, what it stands for, what its leaders should be doing. And that is the question that the incoming new emperor will have to figure out much better than Nero ever did. And that's where we will pick up the story next. Thank you.